Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. I am pleased to introduce our two guests. We have with us today Save the Children President and CEO, Janti Soeripto, and the Country Director of Save the Children Afghanistan, Nyamandi. Welcome to you both. Thanks for being with us today. Chris, I want to go right to you and talk a little bit about what you're seeing in Afghanistan. Obviously, all of us have been paying deep attention to what is happening in that country at this moment. Please tell us what's happening from your perspective, what Save the Children has been up to, and how you are seeing this conflict and everything that's been going on affect children specifically.
Thank you very much, Teresa. And again, thanks to Devex for giving us this opportunity. What has happened in Afghanistan, of course, has been difficult. Huge numbers of people have been displaced right now because of the conflict that has happened. As I am in Kabul at this point, it appears that the violence has now subsided and people are beginning to come to terms with the transition that has happened. But again, if you look back to where we are today, Afghanistan was already in a huge humanitarian crisis. We're talking about 14 million people who are struggling to get food, 1 in 2 children under the age of 5 who are malnourished. So the humanitarian indicators were already worse even before this transition happened. And with this transition, we are concerned that the situation is going to get worse and worse in Afghanistan as the economy tanks and the situation becomes even more difficult for the people in Afghanistan.
And from your perspective, how is the recent takeover of the Taliban going to affect children in Afghanistan?
Yeah, thanks. So what's happening right now is that the basic services that were being provided mostly by international donors. As you know, Afghanistan was getting probably 60 to 70% of their budget support was coming from international donors. So most of those basic services have stopped, including clinics. Over 500 clinics across the country are not operational right now. So that is affecting children. These are places where women were giving birth. These are places where we were monitoring nutrition indicators and providing basic nutrition treatment, nutritious porridge and food for children. So for sure, we believe if nothing happens in the shortest period, children are going to die. Again, before the Taliban takeover and before COVID, 3.7 million children in Afghanistan were not in school. And now, many more children are not going to school, especially girls, because it's not clarified at this point how the education system is going to work, and teachers are not paid. So the humanitarian situation, the indicators for children are going to be even worse in Afghanistan.
Janti, I want to come to you now. Tell me a little bit about how, as head of Save the Children, you are thinking about what's going on in Afghanistan organizationally, how you are all trying to strategize so that all these problems and the dire situation that Chris just laid out for us, you can be responding to, while also keeping in mind, of course, this is not the only country you work in, and unfortunately, this isn't the only place in the world right now that children are facing dire circumstances.
Yeah, thanks, Teresa. Yes, you're right. Save the Children works in 120 countries. We were discussing how Afghanistan is, of course, an extreme situation, but that we have a number of countries currently where a number of these extreme situations are happening all at the same time. We have it in Afghanistan. We see in Myanmar, where we were forced to suspend programs temporarily. Of course, we had Haiti, a sudden onset disaster, which in any normal times would already be cause for a real effort, a surge, a lot of attention coming towards that. And now we see that it barely actually hits the headlights for a week. And that's not to talk of the many displacement and conflict crises across Africa. We're talking about Tigray, We still have millions of people displaced because of the Syria crisis. And then we have millions of children displaced in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And I could go on for a while. So, and then we'd be here for an hour, I think. So yes, we do have a ton of crises on the hoof, but Afghanistan has really shot to the top, of course, of the last, I would say, number of months, because of course we've been in country since 1976, and we are firmly committed to stay. But clearly, we have to also deal with the immediate crisis at hand. Our initial and immediate concern, and still is the safety of our staff in country, our partners, the many community volunteers that we work with across the country, the majority of whom are women, which of course concerns us the most. So staff safety, security is up front of our mind. Secondly, the situation around the imploding economy in the banking system. If there is no ability for humanitarian organizations to get access to cash in country, it's going to be difficult to maintain sustainable programming. And then lastly, of course, and since we, I'm sure Chris can talk a little bit about this, when we're looking to restart our programs, we need to make sure that we can do so on the jointly agreed humanitarian principles. And we would love enough for nothing more than to restart life-saving services for children. But of course, we need to be able to do it so that it's as safe as possible for our staff, but that it also upholds the principles of our humanitarian work. For instance, working with female staff across our many regional offices.
Yeah, that's a great point that you brought up. One of many just there about, access to the funding that you need to do this work. Obviously, there have been outstanding questions about how international funds will be able to reach Afghanistan. We obviously saw the pledging conference last week, sort of still some outstanding questions about how those funds are actually going to reach people on the ground. Janti, tell me a little bit about sort of how you guys are thinking about that organizationally. Are you, speaking with governments, advocating for, free flow of cash and making sure that your people on the ground actually do have access to that to carry out the programming?
Yeah, that is exactly right. We're looking at possible options. A key element of that, of course, is advocating, particularly with the U.S. government, for humanitarian exemptions, and we've seen this in other countries before, where we've had those general agreements that for humanitarian work exemptions could be made. Broad brush sanctions, in my opinion, tend to hurt the most vulnerable and the poorest of the population, not so much sometimes the people that it's intended to hit. So targeted sanctions tend to be better, particularly if humanitarian response is happening concurrently.
And Chris, back to you now. Tell us a little bit about your situation on the ground. You're coming to us from the UN compound. What has it been like for you, over the past several weeks there on the ground? As Janti mentioned, obviously, number one priority is safety of staff. What has it felt like for you to be operating there? Obviously, Save the Children's work is really important, and we've been talking about that, but it can't be done without your staff on the ground. So tell us what you're thinking and feeling.
Thanks a lot, Teresa. So let me start by saying, just to add to the question about the donor conference last week and why this is important. So winter is coming, and the winter in Afghanistan can be very harsh. We have a month between now and when the winter is going to set in. So it's important that these funds that have been pledged. I think it was heartwarming to see all the solidarity in the UN conference in Geneva. But it's time for that to move now to action, including pre-positioning NFIs. 750,000, over 400,000 children right now left their homes, and they are living under plastic sheeting and sticks, and they don't have access to food. So it's important that we turn around that money into actions on the ground as soon as possible. Now to your second question about staffing situation, one of the reasons why I have remained in Afghanistan is because we are committed to stay and deliver. Last week, we restarted our health programs in Kandahar, with both male and female staff and doctors going to provide assistance and monitoring the situation on the ground, collecting nutrition data, especially for children. And indeed, immediately became clear that children, many more children are malnourished at this point and they need assistance. So it's important that as Save the Children, we are able to stay in Afghanistan and provide assistance. We are encouraged that the Taliban has been issuing assurances to NGOs and to the UN that we can stay and deliver. But I think we have to see more action, especially on the sides of freedoms for our female staff. It's important for our female staff to be able to go to the field, because for us to access children, we have to do that together with their mothers. And for us to be able to access mothers, our female staff are key. Our staff are stressed, they are concerned, they are anxious, but there's also a renewed energy towards reopening of our activities. And I hope that we'll be able to even reopen in other provinces in the coming days.
Thanks so much for that, Chris. Yeah, it's been, obviously stark for those of us around the world that have only been watching on TV. So I can't imagine what it's been like for you there on the ground doing this work, being in country and knowing what the need is, knowing how many children are in need of these services and maybe not obviously being able to do all the programming that you would like in the moment you would like. So thanks for all the work that you're doing. Janti, I want to come back to you to talk a little bit bigger picture again in terms of the famine numbers that we're seeing. Obviously, as Chris just mentioned, a really stark malnutrition situation happening in Afghanistan. But as you mentioned in the beginning, not the only country that unfortunately we are seeing these dire conditions in. How are you as Save the Children thinking about the condition of famine specifically and advocating for action to prevent that before it happens, if possible, and if it comes to that, respond if that's necessary?
Yes, thanks. And before Haiti, before Afghanistan happened over this past summer, Save the Children launched its largest ever humanitarian appeal, $130 million in May, essentially on because we wanted to respond and be prepared for the hunger and famine crisis that is unfolding in around 20 countries around the world. We have chosen to focus on 13 of those 20 where we felt we had the biggest and strongest presence, where we can make the biggest difference. And we do see a real coming together of, existing and worsening conflict, climate change, and then of course this pandemic to push hunger and malnutrition levels to a record high over these past years. If you look at the global numbers, and I know sometimes millions, just float over people's heads, but almost 6 million children under 5 are currently on the brink of starvation across the globe. So, we're seeing, as we speak, this is not even a theoretical risk anymore. As we speak, we are seeing families, parents, mothers, fathers, making difficult choices every day because they have to skip meals. They don't know where the next meal is going to come from. So that is a real concern. And it does remind us, in 2011, Oxfam and Save the Children published a report, which at the time was very influential, I think. It was called Dangerous Delays, about the delay of declaring a crisis, a famine crisis in 2011, when we estimated that, hundreds of thousands of people died, probably unnecessarily, because there were all the signs were there. It's just that the international community, including organizations like Oxfam and Save the Children, were slow to respond. And we also know that preparedness, early action, can actually save lives. So just a couple of countries here, Yemen, of course, ongoing conflict and really imploding economy mean that over 80% of that population needs humanitarian assistance, and that is a lot of that is around food insecurity and malnutrition. Before Afghanistan, Yemen was probably the country that we were worried about the most, and we've been there again since the late 70s, and we've treated more than 300,000 children, I think, there for malnutrition over the past sort of 5 to 6 years. We see a place like Madagascar, hugely hit by their worst drought in the last 40 years, hitting livelihoods as well as crops, and again, really getting the planting and the harvest season off to a terrible start. Then, of course, we have Haiti, which I mentioned before, hit by an earthquake, hit by a hurricane. But of course, before that, Haiti had, I think, 4 million people already in a situation of food insecurity. So again, the people who bore the brunt of this particular earthquake last month are now experiencing acute food shortages and insecurities. And again, schools there are closed. And as we know, when schools close, and we even saw that in the United States last year during the pandemic, when schools close, a lot of vulnerable children actually go without the one nutritious meal in the day that they have. And again, in Haiti, we're concerned about the winter planting season, which is very, close. And we're worried about them being ready on time to actually make that work. So again, these are just 3 examples of countries where we're working and where we see for those various reasons, pandemic, conflict, and climate change, where we see situations worsening for people.
And Janti, I think one of the most important things for us to talk about in this conversation is what can be done. Obviously, you and Chris have both been laying out, some pretty dire circumstances, both in Afghanistan, other countries around the world. What does the international community need to be doing to appropriately respond to these crises?
Yeah, thanks, Teresa. That is critically important. What Save the Children is currently doing is really maintaining essential health and nutrition services. And Chris was talking earlier about how we even started to do that in Afghanistan. Protecting and promoting and supporting breastfeeding, complementary feeding, particularly for infants and young children, and then protecting family livelihoods, including cash transfers, to make sure that that they continue to have access to nutritious food where that is possible. And I would say from the international community, and I'm sure this sounds familiar, but the community has to manage the risks, not always the crisis. We have enough early warning triggers that we know we can monitor in order to be there and to be prepared and to pre-position supplies before the crisis actually gets worse or happens. To have fully funded and flexible funding for humanitarian response plans, and also for donors to really prioritize cash and voucher assistance for families, and to prioritize the increased risk of violence, particularly gender-based violence, that we're seeing also that we also see increase around the world. So those are some of the ideas that we have around what can be done and what we're asking all of our partners to do.
Thank you for that, Janti. I think it's great to end on a call to action. Thank you so much for being with us. Chris, thank you. Stay safe where you are. Thank you both for joining us today for this important conversation.
Thank you very much, Teresa.